What's up everybody, Brian Earhart here with Team Discraft. This is another episode of Level Up. Today I'm going to be talking about 4 different types of Hyzer lines to help you maneuver courses more precisely. Let's get into it. Okay, getting right into it, the very first type of Hyzer that I want to talk about is the basic stock Hyzer, also sometimes called a fieldwork Hyzer. This is the most simple shot that you can throw in disc golf. You're simply taking the disc, whatever stability, swinging it out wide and letting the stability of the disc crash you back to your target. This is what I see most new players do, but I want to talk about this basic Hyzer because there are some players that get into disc golf not learning how to throw an intentional Hyzer line. Whether the first disc that they buy is a very overstable driver, or they just figure out that a flex shot is what gets them the most distance, some players don't know how to intentionally snap a disc on that angle and use it to their advantage in regards to accuracy. So what I want to say to these players is if you are a player who does like to throw flex shots or really just throw flat as your default shot, something to pay attention to when you're trying to throw these on purpose is the tilt of your spine. I say this time and time again when I teach the game. If we have our disc on a nice, even swing plane here, we can create the angle of release simply by tilting our spine over and allowing our torso and shoulders to rotate on that line. Throwing flat should be very similar in body positioning to throwing Hyzer. We don't do too much different with our arm here. So again, if you're the kind of player who really likes to lean into their shots and throw this way and pull the disc, you can learn an intentional Hyzer again by getting your swing plane level and tilting at your spine. And that's a great place to start learning that stock Hyzer. It's gonna really help you with accuracy. It's one angle, and you really don't have to worry about all sorts of variables when you do that. The one thing I will say, a lot of players when they're throwing a stock Hyzer, they throw an extremely overstable disc. And since you're already throwing the disc on this angle, you don't necessarily need to throw something super overstable. If you throw something neutral or even something a little understable, you'll keep that one angle flight, but you're gonna get a little bit more glide out of it and you're gonna get a softer landing. All right, Hyzer shape number 2, and this is my personal favorite, the stall Hyzer. This is a very counterintuitive feeling shot, especially calling it a Hyzer, because we're not stabilizing the disc by the wing angle. We are not throwing a Hyzer release when we throw this shot. We're stabilizing a stall Hyzer with the nose angle being up and the disc being higher in the air. This is how we can get really soft landings on our shots with still a decent amount of power. The trick is not to be hunched over like we normally would be if we throw a Hyzer. For this shot, to throw it so high and get it to actually be flat, we have to actually throw a little bit of anhyzer. This is why I say it feels counterintuitive. So a lot of the players who like to throw flex shots or flat shots naturally might really like throwing a stall Hyzer as their default. What you do is you pull back, you definitely have to lean back into the shot and you have to tilt this back shoulder down because we're throwing up in the air. So we want to make sure that we get a stable, fast driver, high, nose up, and anhyzer. Very quickly, because of the nose up, it's gonna flatten, and then once it runs out of speed and spin, it's gonna drop out of the sky. And the best part about a stall Hyzer is, in certain wind conditions, like a fighting crosswind for a righty that would be a left to right crosswind, you can throw a stall Hyzer and turn it into a helping wind. So you can have that carry underneath the bottom of the disc, and then you can have the stall Hyzer fall out of the flight. So if you can throw a stock Hyzer and a stall Hyzer, it only helps you when you play against different winds. All right, so Hyzer shape number 3, and this is probably the most technical shot of the 4. This is the push Hyzer. So the push Hyzer is a very direct Hyzer line. It's usually thrown very steep and also with a very understable disc. There's a couple different applications here. Scenario number 1 that you'd use a push Hyzer would be if you have a very tight gap off the tee and it's better to hit this gap with a steep angle with something very understable that then rides to flat and stays on that direct line. And for scenario number 2, you might have a dog leg with a very subtle bend in the fairway and not a lot of room off to the side to swing the hyzer wide. So you're gonna need a hyzer that stands up as it's fading in the direction you want it to fade so it matches the fairway better. A few tips for these types of hyzers is number 1, since we have no room to swing these push hyzers wide at all, and that's our natural inclination when it comes to throwing a hyzer, I always close my stance off just a tiny bit more than usual because I want to force myself to throw that shot forward. So it might even feel like I'm aligning for an anhyzer or a roller, but since I'm throwing such a steep hyzer, it actually works out and you can kind of jam that disc forward on the line. Number 2, if you're throwing a really understable driver and you're kind of afraid of flipping it over, something I like to tell myself when I'm throwing these really technical push hyzer angles is to pretend like there's a putter or a catch disc in your hand and shorten your body up accordingly to throw the shot. Push hyzer shots need a lot of spin to have that smooth turn happen. So if you just pretend something slower and flippier is in your hand, it's a very good way of telling your body what to do. The last thing that I highly recommend is to tell yourself to throw the disc out and not up. Use that mental anchor when you're throwing these types of shots. I think our natural tendency is to throw hyzers high and wide, and for a push hyzer, it's quite the opposite. So if you can practice shortening up, closing off your stance, and throwing the disc out, you'll be very successful throwing this, and it's an amazing shot to throw in very specific technical holes. And the final hyzer shape we're talking about today is a very power-oriented shot, the spike hyzer. This is a very useful shot for not hitting gaps and just going over the canopy of trees to avoid any obstacles that you don't want to hit. Something a lot of people do when it comes to spike hyzers that they mess up is that naturally they like to fall over this brace foot when they throw, so it's very difficult for them to throw straight up in the air. So something that I tell myself when I throw spike hyzer is to make sure I keep my weight back. Having a strong brace foot and a strong plant is very, very important when it comes to spike hyzer because you don't want any momentum going forward. You want momentum going upwards. So it's a lot of power from your legs, and also, like I just said, we cannot by any means fall over our front foot. The other thing that you have to really focus on, even more than the stock hyzer I just said earlier, is spine tilt. This is something that cannot be compromised with this shot. If you want to throw a spike hyzer, you want your torso and shoulders, which create that rotational momentum, to be really bent over. If you watch professional players throw spike hyzers, they are really bent over. Their disc is on a very steep angle and they throw up against that front foot. Learning to throw an effective spike hyzer is an awesome tool when it comes to attacking protected greens and not having to deal with the gaps leading up to said basket. The spike hyzer is one angle and one angle only, a very steep hyzer, and it's thrown with a stable to overstable disc most of the time. So there's a lot less variables that you have to worry about. Height is really the only thing you have to think about when throwing this shot. All right, so a quick recap. We have the push hyzer, we have the stock hyzer, we have the stall hyzer, and we have the spike hyzer. All sorts of different shapes thrown from this angle. The things to keep in mind are when you're creating a different angle with your body, do it with the tilt of your spine. Make sure your torso and your shoulders are rotating on the same angle that you want the disc to come out on. And depending on the stability of the disc that you choose to throw, make sure to shorten or lengthen your swing to accommodate for that shot. Thanks again for tuning in. Leave us a comment down below with your favorite type of hyzer line to throw and let us know any topics you'd like us to cover in the future. We will see you next time.